Neve, could you get the other light for me? Thank you very much. Alrighty, so we were talking about the history of France and the various art movements that are related to that history. And we had mentioned that Louis Philippe was elected as a parliamentary monarch, right? A monarch in the British style system where his power would be checked by a parliament, right? He couldn't make rules unilaterally without going to this governing body that was elected by the people, represented the people, to keep him from being a jerk, right? Keep him from being a dictator. And this happened in 1830 after the Second Revolution. That was Eugene Delacroix, right? The famous picture of the Second Revolution. That brought in now Louis Philippe. But Louis Philippe was, as it turned out, a megalomaniac, right? He really wanted to have dictatorial powers. And he started to really stomp on everything, including the free press, right? Sounds all too familiar in some ways. But, you know, sort of outlawing criticism of himself. And one of the great critics was Daumier, Honoré Daumier, who was working in lithography. This is a new kind of printmaking we haven't talked about before, lithography, where you chemically treat a piece of limestone so that parts of it are hydrophilic. In other words, parts of it bead water away. And then you roll it with an oil-based ink, and the dry parts of the stone take the ink and you can transfer it to a piece of paper. Right? So it allows you to give the effect of a crayon drawing. And this was used for newspaper printing, as well as poster printing, through most of the 19th century. It's a very different process than either engraving, etching on the one hand, or woodcuts on the other, because it's not a physical change to the surface, it's a chemical change to the surface. Right? So this is a lithography, and these were printed in newspapers. There were 2 or 3 different journals that he worked with. I think that was one of the worksheet questions, was what journals did Daumier work for? They were incredibly popular. Everybody likes a good joke, especially a joke in the joke on the leadership, right? And so here, Louis Philippe is depicted with this weird sort of mutton chops, which he had, and a pear-shaped head, being fed money that's been drawn from the poor, and sitting on a commode that's based on 17th century furniture. So he's meant to look like Louis XIV, right? The old royalty. And he's defecating out the back various public offices. In other words, he's creating more administration. He's creating more bloat, right? That's all the money's good for. And the title Gargantua is based on a 16th century satirical play by France's national hero, a guy named Rabelais. Right? He is to French literature what Shakespeare is to the British. Like the great Renaissance playwright, Rabelais, wrote about Gargantua as this glutton, right? This monstrous glutton. Right? And so we see in the back, coming from his hind, various letters and prefectures being then hauled off to the French government. Okay, Louis Philippe, his hard-fisted style of government, his intolerance of the poor, led to the Third Revolution in 1848. Right, so we've seen now 3 French revolutions in the course of under roughly 60 years, right? And the Third Revolution, during the Third Revolution, people rose up in Paris, and what they did in order to beat the royal troops, right, the government troops, was they used the small alleyways of Paris, the old city, not the new one that we're so used to today with the big wide boulevards, but the small side streets that kind of wander around. They were able to pull up the cobblestones and build up barriers, they called them barricades, right, along the streets, and that meant that the troops would have to funnel down to sort of narrow areas. They'd get to the barricades, and the people with just rocks and, limited arms could really do barricade warfare, right? So that's what we see here, the small streets of Paris and Daumier's painting on the left, documenting this uprising of the common people against Louis Philippe, who we see here in Gargantua on the right. Right, so does that bring it back to full circle? Yeah.
Didn't he get arrested?
Yes, exactly. This very print got him put in jail for 6 months. After he was let out, he continued to do it, but he was a little bit more careful afterwards. One of the things that Louis Philippe complained about is the fact that his face looked like a pear. And what Daumier did, it's really funny. There's a print where he goes, and he has these 6 pictures of a pear, and each one looks a little bit more like Louis Philippe. It starts off as a pear, and it ends up as says, if this is just a pear, why is this not scandal? And each one has a little sort of acerbic thing underneath, and basically, eventually, boom, 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 and then there he is with the mutton chops in the last one, looking like Louis Philippe. But if you see parts of Louis Philippe, it's not that far off. Actually, he kind of had a pinhead profile, right, as well. He wasn't a very well, none of our French kings are all that handsome, but Louis Philippe, he's right up there with ugly kings of all time, right? Okay, so our uprising in 1848 was to get rid of this sort of heavy-handed, dictatorial kind of rule. And the French then decide, after 1848, that they're going to now put in a system of government that's more like the American system. It's going to be a president with a fixed term, a 4-year term, right? And they're also going to instigate a number of different social programs that are intended to help the people that Louis Philippe had turned his back on, right? So under Louis Philippe, the poor had gotten poorer, right? Parts of Paris were in horrible shape, but all over the country, famine was everywhere, right? And there were a number of public programs that were instigated in 1848 that were intended to help the working poor. People who were working hard, working their entire lives, but were not reaping any of the benefits. Again, does this kind of sound protests over the last couple of years, about the other 99 and all of that, right? Sounds strikingly familiar. Right? And this led to an art movement that actually focused on these people and tried to bring grandeur and nobility to the working class. Scenes of everyday life, scenes of real life, if you will, but on a scale that no one had ever painted the working man before. This was roughly about 10 feet across. Huge pictures. A scale that's normally reserved for big history pictures. Remember, those were the most important kinds. Or portraits of kings. And in a way, when Courbet does these stone breakers on life-sized scale, he's trying now also to aggrandize them and say that they're every bit as important to document for all time as kings, as ancient Roman history. The modern world is just as important. That's part of Courbet's message, right? And so this movement becomes known as realism. And it has nothing to do with being realistic. When we talk about realism, we think about it as not being, he's more realistic than Daumier is. But that's not what the term means. The term means a focus on the realities of modern existence, right? The real elements of modern existence, and in particular, the lives of the working class. That's the major part of it, but really this focus on the modern world, right? And it's a reaction against Romanticism. It's a reaction, all those parts of those elements still carry through. A lot of what Romanticism was still very much carries through. Interest in the power of nature, that doesn't really go away anytime soon, right? A certain darkness to some of the themes, that kind of continues on as well. But what they're reacting against are the traditions in French art in particular, which had focused on historical scenes and given such great value to them. And a critic writing about the Salon in 1846, just before the Revolution, the Third Revolution, a critic visited the Salon, and this was normal, to write up a review of the Salon, and he wrote, man, when people are going to look back at the 19th century in France, they're not going to know anything that happened. They're just going to see pictures of ancient Rome. pictures of biblical history. You know, they're going to see the sons of Horatius, right? They're not going to know anything about it. And there are things going on, he said, in contemporary France that are every bit as worth documenting as ancient Roman history. So painters, get up and do it, right? Now, Daumier is already kind of doing this. Part of it's coming out of the fact that he'd been a newspaper illustrator, so that kind of makes sense, right? He's a forerunner of this realist movement. But what we see after the revolution with the focus on the common man, a greater focus on it by artists as well. The other thing that happened in 1848 that leads to this focus on the working poor was the publish of the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. Came out in 1848 as well. And that had a huge impact on artists immediately because that too focused heavily on the working class. Right? The history of Europe is a history of class struggle. Right? Okay, so Courbet focuses on this. It's something that he saw on the side. He posed models in the studio. He's not painting outside yet, right? Poses models to replicate something that struck him on the way home. There are two men that are grading a road. By that I mean that they're making the slope of a road that goes through the mountains, and we can see the mountains in the background, right? They're making the slope of the road as it goes through the pass less steep by cutting a hole through the ridge. Now these days, of course, we do it with tractors, right? Backhoes and whatnot, but they're literally doing it by hand, smoothing out the road. And they're breaking up the stones to make it paved so that people can get from the center of France, which is Paris, to the outlying regions more quickly and easily, both by highways. Now, we're way in advance of auto cars, right? Horse-drawn carriages still, but by roadway or by railway. People can get around more easily. And they're helping with this interconnection of all of France, but they're the people that will never, ever use that road themselves. So Courbet's message is not only one of the sort of the honor and the dignity of the working class, but also on the fact that it's kind of a protest piece, that the working class are still working for the benefit of somebody else. They're grading a road to some country village. In fact, it's the village where Courbet grew up. And they're grading the road to that village. But they're the sort of people that live in that village and really are not going to benefit from it as much as the people from the big cities who might come out to visit for the weekend. Right? So they're working for the benefit of someone else. And Courbet says that this picture is intended, on one hand, to dignify the worker, but on the other hand, to show really that this lot in life that they have, their role, is one that's kind of miserable. And if you look at the picture, how does he do this? How does he make it somewhat miserable as an existence? Not a good job to have. I guess we got no job that's a good job to have, but it's not one that we're going to college to hopefully end up doing. Although I will tell you that my first job after I got a master's degree in art history, I was breaking glass with a hammer, kicking out in a factory. They said, "Do you want to deconstruct cathode ray tubes, which are old computers?" I said, "Yeah, that sounds kind of fun." And they gave me a hammer. And they were crushing the glass down so they could ship it off to be recycled. And that was it. That was my first job. So I was a stone breaker. I was a glass breaker. Right? Don't get a master's degree in art history. There's my advice to you, right? How does he make them more miserable? What sort of tricks does he play? Keeping in mind that this is posed, right? This is a composition. It's not it's not a photograph. It's not by chance. Everything is chosen here. What choices does he make that help to turn it from a truly dignified portrait into something that is meant to make you feel sorry for them? Danielle.
Like he specifically, the guy on the left looks very comfortable, like it hurts to carry the rock.
Yeah, those rocks he's carrying are not light, right? So he's got them rested on his knee, as a matter of fact, as he's hauling them off the road, right? So the guy on the right's breaking the rocks up small, so the guy on the left can carry them away. okay? So we read the picture, that's kind of what's going on. One guy's sort of breaking the bigger rocks into smaller rocks. The other one's carrying the smaller rocks off to the side of the road so that they can then smooth out that grade, right? So, yeah, it looks incredibly heavy. What else? Yeah, Brandon.
Their clothes are all ripped out.
Clothes are horribly ripped up and patched as well, right? So, yeah, the kid on the left is just torn. He's got that one suspender over his shoulder. I'm not quite sure if it's a suspender or if it's helping to hold the rocks as well, right? Both of them have patched knees. Both of them have rips everywhere you can see the vest of the man on the right, right? So the clothes are not, of course, they're breaking in stone. So, you know, when I go out and I work on my Vespa, I wear crappy clothes as well, and I do it on purpose because I don't want to wear my good clothes. But you get the sense that that's kind of what they are. It helps to define them as characters.
He doesn't show either of their faces.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting thing, right? It doesn't show their faces. Now, we saw it with Goya, right? We saw the 3rd of May, right? We saw them without their faces, and it sort of dehumanizes them, right? And in Goya's hands, that dehumanization was there to sort of make them as the agents of terror, right? Of military terror. But here, that suggests that there's nothing there but the work, right? It doesn't make them wonderful individuals, but and I always think that this is kind of like, you ever driving on the road, when you're driving and you see traffic bottlenecks because they're doing some work on the shoulder is closed and they're doing work on the shoulder, and you see the workers, all you see is what they're wearing, and you don't really look at them as individuals, you don't look at their faces. You could never describe one of them and pick them out of a police lineup if you had to, after you got home. They're the job, right? And that's kind of the case here, right? They're the job. Sorry? The food, there's very little, well, they're bringing their own, right?
Yeah.
So they've got a pot back here with a spoon and whatnot, probably more likely water, right? And you get the sense also that even though we have a shadow up there, it looks awfully darn hot, right? The shadow cast across his face, the hat. There's also little subtle things, right? Look at the age, even though we can't see the faces, the ages of the two of them. Got a kid and an old man, right? And you don't know how old he is, but his skin is just dry from having been out here in the sun all the time, right? And that gives you the sense that what's waiting for that kid if he does a good job? He maybe gets to come up here, and be the one that breaks the rocks rather than carries the rocks. It's not really a bright future in this job, right? All of these things add up to make it, in fact, an image of misery. And this is exactly what it's meant to be because, again, they're not working for their own profit, right? And what I mean by profit is not just money. They're not working for their own benefit. They're working for someone else's benefit. And that's part of Courbet's message. We don't have a really good Courbet here, and I'm sorry this is such a crusty slide. It's never on display, so I haven't had a chance to even see this yet, right? But this is on the way to the town of Ornans, which is where Courbet grew up, and you can tell from the rocks in the background exactly where we are and the kind of a landscape that they're working their way through. And it's part of this idea of connecting France, which was part of the bigger plan of putting people back to work after the 1848 revolution. Also, the idea of connectivity helps with commerce, right? All of this was supposed to spur the economy as well. Ornans is over near Switzerland. It's in the sort of the foothills of the Alps. And this is where Courbet grew up, and it's this cute little town alongside of a river. And like I said, we don't have a very good Courbet here for you to see. And even the one on the right, the Stonebreakers, his single most famous work, actually no longer exists. It was blown up in World War II. This is the best photo that's out there, right? Oh, it was digital, so it's one of 8 million of the best photos that's out there. But it was blown up in Dresden during the firebombing of Dresden. Everybody, year by year, waits that somebody saved it, but there's been no sign of that, alas. But it's such a perfect picture for explaining what realism is all about. Numerous artists picked up on the idea of dignifying the working class. And not always was it meant to be this miserable, although usually that's kind of part of the underpinning of it. It's almost like it's art of a social protest, right? So in this case, one of the government plans in 1848 to eradicate hunger was to legalize an old medieval tradition. called gleaning. Right? Gleaning, you ever just use what I can glean from this article, what I can glean from reading this, right? We use it kind of haphazardly, but what gleaning was a very specific thing, which was that in the Middle Ages, peasants working for a feudal lord, right, had the right, after they had reaped the fields for the lord, they had the right to go out and pick up the scraps and feed their family with it. It's pretty horrible sounding, isn't it, right? You cut all this wheat down, you give it off to the feudal lord, right, the liege of the property, and then you can go back out and you can pick up what's left, and you can eat that, no free of charge, right? You can just have what's left. And that's what they're doing here. The gleaners are now under the new government after 1848. They've set up a program wherein the local people can go to an industrial farm and they can glean it. They can pick up what's left after it's been harvested. And Millet shows us in the background the harvest, right? It's fantastic. These huge mountains of wheat, right? Hay wains, hay carts, carting it off. People, I've got a nice detail here, right? People with bales of wheat over their shoulders. This is an industrial farm. There's their residences in the back right. There's a man on a horse, the sort of field boss out there as well, right? And in the foreground are the hungry, the people who are allowed to go pick up the scraps to feed their family. And Millet, he wants to dignify them. He gives them much more solidity than anybody else in the picture. We still don't see their faces, right? So they're not individualized. They're not totally aggrandized by this. But at the same time, there's a bit of an individuality to the three different colors of their headdresses, right? But there's still also the sense that there's a juxtaposition between the little that they're able to glean here, which they're supposed to feed their families with, right? And we should presume that there are three families here, represented by these three women, versus all of that wheat in the background. It's going to be sold off for profit. It's going to feed somebody somewhere, but it's going to go through a middleman first, right? And not necessarily feeding any of the people that are working it either, right? So there's this juxtaposition of plenty and want, right? Plenty in the background, want in the foreground. And it seems as if Millet's statement is one of, hey, this government program kind of sucks, right? This isn't really doing what it's set out to do. It's a step in the right direction, but really, is this going to work? It shows, however, what Millet is best at, which is focusing now on these images of the rural working class, people out in the fields. Right? He's sort of south of Paris by about 50, 75 miles or so in the flatlands around the capital. So that's his most famous work. We have a few Millets up in Baltimore at the Walters Art Museum. And again, he likes to put these figures sort of large in the foreground, almost taller than, if they were to stand up, taller than the horizon line, giving them a sense of monumentality, right, of solidity, modeling them in very solid three dimensions, which gives their work a level of dignity, right, but often undercut by the fact that for that dignity, they still suffer in poverty, right? Still emphasizing the degree to which this is a very impoverished existence, but one that, despite that, is still one filled with dignity. So our potato harvest here shows a family gathering up sacks of potatoes, and again, there's a sense here, I think, that maybe this is enough, right? We have sacks and sacks and sacks of potatoes for their harvest, people helping them harvest in the background. A sort of a looming storm. They're going to be out there despite the weather. These romantic ideas about the power of nature never disappear, right? They're still here as well. But still part of this realist movement, this movement that's focusing on dignifying the working class, raising them to a status and depicting them in art in a way they've never been depicted before. And often on a scale that had been reserved for the ruling classes, right? Trying to elevate them. Another realist painter, the realist movement lasts forever. It lasts really deep into the late 19th, early 20th century in America. Another harvesting picture, very similar to Millet's harvesting picture by Jules Breton, and this is really quite large. It's about 6 or 7 feet across the base. So again, it gives you the sense, down at the National Gallery here, gives you a sense of that use of scale as a way of suggesting that the thing that's being depicted is important. Right? We saw that with Constable and his landscapes, right? Making these monster 6-foot landscapes, simply to say that that the picture, the thing that's in the picture, is important. And in this case, that's what all of these artists are doing. This is every bit as important as the things that are normally depicted at this scale. Right? So in this case, the colza and rapeseed are the same thing. It's a seed that is it's a seed from a flower, a yellow flower that's from the mustard family, and the seeds are gathered and removed from the flowers so that they can be ground up and milled, and oil can be extracted from them. Right? So rapeseed oil is, in fact, it's kind of similar to canola oil. Right? It's a cooking oil, a sort of light, flavorless cooking oil. And our workers here in the field are gathering up the rapeseed itself so that it can be taken off for the seeds to be harvested. And the woman in the center is sifting out the seeds. Right? And you can see that very much like Millet, Breton wants us to see the dignity of the worker, the monumentality, this massive, strong woman in the foreground, sifting out this pile of rapeseed. But again, are they doing this for themselves, or are they harvesting for someone else? Right? This is kind of a question that's there. But if you look at the way in which he poses her with these strong, muscular arms and with her chin up high, right? It's very different in a way than what Courbet was doing. Because I don't think that Breton is a card-carrying socialist like Courbet was, right? So Courbet's Stonebreakers is really all about sort of like, man, this sucks, right? This is really hard, horrible work. But for Breton, the hard work adds dignity to the figure, I think. It doesn't mean that they're not without their troubles, but there is a sense, with her pose being so erect and her chin so high in the air, that this is work that is not absolutely horrific for her to do. At the same time, these people are deeply, deeply poor, and no child care, right? They have to bring the children out to the fields with them. So here's a woman with a bucket for the seeds that she's sifting them into, gathering them there, and I would presume her older daughter and her youngest child next to her, nowhere else for them to go, right? This is it's not something that allows them the sorts of comforts that other people who live in the cities have. And part of the issue with the work, part of the agenda of the art, is in fact to enlighten people who see it. Right? When Breton shows this at the Salon in Paris, which is where it was intended to be seen, right? The people in Paris become more aware of what life is like outside of their sphere. Right? They become enlightened to the problems that face other people in the country, and not sort of just all about my own backyard. Right? So it is very much an art with a social agenda. Right? And I think in many ways that's what sets realism apart from earlier images that we saw, where we saw scenes of everyday life. Right? Dutch Baroque pictures didn't really have a social agenda. They might have had some moralizing themes there, but it wasn't sort of like trying to change all society for the better. But what we have here is the beginning of art, an artist realizing that his role in society is not just a guy painting in a studio making pretty stuff, but that art has the capacity to play a positive role in the future direction of one's own world. And I think for me, one of the things I really like about it, I like realism anyway. I think it's pretty cool stuff. But one of the things that I really take away from it, I think that's holds up 150 years later is this idea that I don't care if you're an artist or not, what you do can matter. You know, that's the message to take away from this, is that we all do things in this world, and there are reasons to do them that are based on what you do. So, you know, Breton is a painter, wants to get his stuff accepted to the salon. That's all well and good. He wants to make beautiful compositions that, you know, have nice, the way the red of that bonnet plays against the blue on the hips of the woman sifting, right? The organization of the figures with the scythes in the background. It's a lovely picture, right? But beyond that, what he does, he realizes, can or cannot have something to do, have something else, a positive role to play in society. And he chooses to not let it be inert, to have what he does make a positive effect. And I think if more of us did that day in and day out, this would be a whole lot better place to live. Right? Not this, Marymount, but this world we live in. Too many people are doing things specifically for their own benefit and not for the idea that maybe there's some ideas out there that I can help to get across. Ideas about social justice. Right? And realism is very much a movement that's focused on social justice. Right? At least for the most part, especially with these peasant pictures, if you will, these rural labor pictures. Now, our last realist artist that we'll look at in France is Edward Manet. And his works are different from the vast majority of realists. He shares with the realists an interest in modern life. Right? Breton, Millet, Courbet, they're painting modern life. 19th century French activities in a sort of unidealized way. You know, this is a matter of fact. This is life. And Manet shares that, very much interested in scenes of modern life. But he's different from the other realists in that he loves the city. He paints modern life in Paris. That is his shtick, right? Scenes of modern urban life rather than scenes of rural life. And with that, what we see with Manet is in fact less of an interest in manual labor. Because in the city you see manual labor less obviously than you do in the countryside. But at the same time, these are images of work nonetheless, because this is probably a nanny, an au pair, if you will. Right? A young woman that's been hired by a family to look after their daughter during the day, a wealthy family. And so she's been out strolling through the streets of Paris, takes a little break to sit down, read a book, cutest puppy in the world, right? With her charge, who is enthralled by watching the trains come and go. So she's looking, and this is what makes this picture fascinating. When you showed this in 1874, people said, railway? What railway? Because you can't see it, right? There is no train. You see the steam that comes from the train engine, but the train's going to be off her right shoulder, all the way to the left of the canvas. It's kind of out of the frame, right? He hides the subject of the picture. But the girl is looking at it, right? The little girl with her back to us is looking at it, just as the woman is looking at you, right? There's this wonderful sort of parallel there between them. And so she's sort of enthralled by it. And then we can see the switching yard here, right, the switching gate for the trains. And this is all the tracks as they come out of the train shed and split off to go different directions, right? You ever been to a major train? This is coming out of Union Station, right? Comes out, you've got a few tracks here, and all of a sudden it's 4, and then it's 6, and then it's 8, right? And so we're in that area where it spreads out so that each of those tracks can go into a different direction. And she's watching this train come and go. Right? So it's modern life. It's as modern as it could possibly be. And in fact, for Manet, this is an important part of what he chooses to paint, which are the elements of Paris that are the views where Paris has changed the most drastically in many ways, where it's as modern as it could possibly be. Now, for you and me, trains are old hat, right? We don't even take them anymore, right? We're talking driverless cars now in the next 5 years or something, right? But trains were brand new. Intercity rail, right? Being able to take a train from Paris to another city was literally 30 years old, right? The very first intercity rail train was 1835, right? It went from Brussels to one of the towns nearby there, right? It had only recently come to Paris. So this is new, right? This is a part of Paris that when that woman was the age of the kid, that wasn't there. And what was there was a neighborhood that was gutted and leveled and cut down below in order to put in the train station, right? So this is modern Paris. And I love the fact that it intrigues the little girl. Ooh, trains. And the woman on the left is like, no big deal. I grew up with this stuff, right? I know it's there. And you can still visit, right? You can go right here, and you can sit there if you want to. It's the here, Gare Saint-Lazare, the Saint-Lazare train station. And so she is over here, behind this train over here, right? And this entire area where the tracks have been placed was cut out of Paris. A lot of people were relocated, right? Disenfranchised, but certainly relocated in order to make this work. And people were marveling at this because the structures themselves were just, fascinating. Nobody had ever seen an interior space as big as a train, a train shed, right? It's the big canopy where all the different tracks are underneath, right? It's a terminus, so they don't go through. They come in, they stop, they go back out again, right? And it's all made out of iron and glass, steel and glass. And because it's steel and glass, which are modern materials, right? Nobody had ever seen sort of things. They were amazing to people in the 19th century. And so there's a sense of wonder about the modern world that Manet is really very, very much interested in here, right? And this was all part of a major renovation of Paris that was going on during Manet's lifetime. Right? So he's picking up on this idea of the most modern scenes in Paris with this image, right? The most modern area of the city. And again, I want to go back and sort of continue to trace this idea of French history, because this renovation of Paris ties directly into the history of France. So, the Third Revolution, this is kind of where we left off, right? The Third Revolution, 1848, brought on the realist movement because it focused on trying to eradicate hunger, right? Trying to look to the needs of the common man in a way that Louis Philippe had not done, right? Using an American-style elective government, a president with a term limit, 4 years, right? This is the Second Republic. This is going to be great, right? They're a new experiment with this. So the Third Revolution is what brings around some of these changes. Now, the man they elect to government, to lead, is the nephew of Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte. His name is Louis Bonaparte? In any event, third year into his reign, right? He's going to be president for 4 years. Year 3, he has himself proclaimed emperor for life, right? So 1851, he's supposed to be out of office by 1852. He says, heck with that, no more elections, I'm emperor, right? Never. Avoid people named Napoleon, right? It's less of this. And so here we see him. Looks kind of like Richard Dreyfuss, the guy from Jaws. But here he is, now 10 years into his reign as emperor, 13 years after being elected as president, as Emperor Napoleon III, right? Now, one of the things that Napoleon III did on assuming power, and he started to do this even before he became emperor, was he wanted to redesign Paris. And he sold it as sanitation, as making Paris safer, cleaner. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to get rid of all those old little winding streets and cut through the boulevards that you know today, right? The big straight boulevards that lead from one monument to the next. So you stand at the Opera House and you can look down to the Champs-Élysées, right? Look down to the Place de la Concorde with the obelisk, or over to the Louvre, right? Or over to Notre Dame. Those boulevards weren't there prior to 1850. That was all part of a redesign of Paris that Napoleon III supervised, right? And he sold it as like, hey, we're gonna have street lights, we're gonna have better sewer systems, no more rats and shit in the streets, Boulevards are gonna let people move from place to place more easily, right? Air will flow better, it will be less disease, right? That's what he's telling people. But what he really wants to make sure is that the barricades will never go up again. Because it's hard to barricade a boulevard, right? You can barricade a small street. But the boulevards, while they allow people to travel from place to place very, very easily, they also allow troops to travel from place to place really easily. So if there's another uprising against them, you got to imagine, taking on the title of emperor, he's got to be expecting something's going to happen, right? He's kind of, he's fail-safing the possibility of an uprising against him by redesigning the city. And part of this redesign is the railway yards, right? It's part of this broad, grand redesign of Paris. So here's another National Gallery picture from an Impressionist painter later. But the Boulevard des Italiens is one of the new boulevards that were carved in under Napoleon III. Hired this man named Haussmann to redesign the city. And the city that you all think of as Old Paris now was really New Paris in 1850, 1860, 1870. Right? What we all know with the storefronts along the ground level, big broad boulevards with people milling around, places for the middle class to live up above, right? The mansard roofs, all of this stuff is part of the redesign of Paris that's taking place during Manet's lifetime. And like I said, the reason for this is a photo from 1848, is to stop that from ever happening again, right? We know people did because cameras needed like a 3-second exposure, right? But there's our barricade. Well, you can see some people actually here, right? Here are some of the barricades on one of the streets in Paris from the 1848 uprising, right? The Third Revolution. So this is what Napoleon III wants. Why he hired Baron Haussmann, right, to redesign Paris was to get rid of this possibility again. And Manet's railway is part of that. Now, this all helps us to understand the picture a little bit better in that, if we think about this picture, we think about, yes, it's as modern can be, okay? But the question is, in 1874, how did people feel about these changes? Not, well, as you might imagine, in a city as big as Paris, not everybody felt the same.
So it wasn't a lot of change, like really fast kind of thing.
That's exactly right. So there's some people that feel that, okay, so there's one group that's like, yay, change is good.
Yeah.
But there's also a whole camp that says, not my Paris. I miss the old ways, right? I miss the old city. And also, think about what the people who used to live there must think.
Yeah.
Having that entirely carved away and gone, right? So what we have, if we look back at the records from this time period in Paris, is that we have a sort of a range of opinion about this, right? Whether it's good or bad, right? And the question is, what does Manet think? And this is much, much more difficult to figure out, if he's positive or negative about this. Sometimes it's very easy with these images to figure out that there's a viewpoint there. Yeah. And with me, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, what I love about this picture, this is one of my favorite pictures in the National Gallery. I think this is a knockout, right? It's so terrific. And by the way, he's painting in the studio, right? So he's posing models and all of that, right? So if you try to go there, it doesn't quite. I have a picture coming up, right? It's his favorite model. She's everywhere in his art, right? What is his attitude? What are the clues to his attitude toward progress, toward change? Because we saw with other artists, like going back to the Romantic period, I'll heat after this, right? If you think back to the Romantic period, right? Think of Constable, right? With the white horse, right? His or Thomas Coleman, right? The American romantic landscape. Both of them saw progress as something problematic. And they tried to seek out areas where progress hadn't hit yet. Right? But at the same time, they're painting the countryside rather than the city, which complicates it, right? So, are there clues here? Is there anything here that might suggest what Manet thinks about all this?
I think it shows both viewpoints. It shows like the new generation more interested in the change and the discovery of all of that, and then the older generation who like lived through the differences and stuff.
And turned her back on it
Yeah.
in a way, right? That's distinctly possible, right? One of the other fascinating things is just behind her hat on the left, that brown doorway, Manet's studio, right? So he looked out over this as well. I think it's interesting, Peyton, that you say it represents both. Maybe it represents also neither, right? It's all things to all people in a way, potentially. One of the other things I think it represents, and this is what I really intrigues me about Manet, and something we'll continue to talk about with him, is the degree to which his pictures make you aware of your role as a viewer. Because you're being looked at while you look at this, right? She is looking directly at you. Right? And that means that you become aware of the fact that you're looking at this picture, looking at her. And one of the things that comes up with Manet's art, which makes him, I think, such a fascinating figure. I'd love to just talk about Manet for an entire semester, because I think there's enough there to do. It's like his pictures seem very much, and this comes out of Courbet as well. Courbet's pictures also have some of this, but Manet pushes it. His pictures raise a question for you, the viewer, about what is a painting. So if I ask you, what is this painting? You'll say it's a girl with her nanny at a railway. But no, it's not. It's a picture. It's paint on a canvas, right? So a painting has two identities. One of them is, what does it represent? Right? What's the subject matter? So what is this picture? Oh, it's a landscape. Oh, it's a genre scene, right? Oh, it's Mona Lisa. It's a $500 million Leonardo, Salvator Mundi. Okay, that's all well and good. But a painting is something else as well. Painting is an object rather than a subject, right? A painting is an artist's manipulation of colors on a flat surface, right? And Manet, when we think about the idea that you become aware that you're looking at this, one of the other things that Manet does, and I don't have details of this one, I should bring them in, but I didn't. I did with other things, is the way he paints. If you spend enough time looking closely enough, is very artificial. He has what are called patches of color. A critic in the 19th century called them Manet's patches of color, to where it looks almost, when you get up close, like a quilt of color, right? I probably should bring some of those details in for you, right? So you have this idea where you're engaging with the picture as an object. A lot of people think about Manet as being a very important figure for modern art, because we think about paintings that lose subject matter and simply become an object, an abstract picture, for example, right? A Jackson Pollock, a Piet Mondrian. If you think about those kinds of pictures, without Manet, that doesn't happen. Now, the other thing that he does, and I haven't gotten around to what I really like about him, is he's captured here something that is, to this day, part of living in the big city, which is engagement with anonymity. She's looking directly at you. You've bothered her. She's reading a book, right? And you've come up and you said, hey, and you assume it's Manet, he's a male painter, right? Hey, hey baby, what are you reading? It's like, shut up. She's reading a book, leave her alone. Right? But she's got her finger in the book so she can talk to you. But that her gaze is entirely anonymous. You know, there's something about it that's just, it's the urban veil. Does anybody here live in the district? Has anybody ever lived in a big city? I went to grad school in New York, right? And I lived in Lower East Side for a while, lived in Brooklyn for a while, lived Wash Heights for a while. I was there for like 10 years. And I came from Portland, right? Podunk little Portland. And back when I left, it was just this tiny little, backwater town. But when I got to New York, it took me a couple years to realize that to survive in the city, you had to put up the shields. There was just, you needed the barrier because there's just too much. And if you let the barrier down, then everybody's going to want a dime, right? Or a dollar, right? Or whatever. You needed to sort of guard yourself. And that anonymity of urban existence is something Manet is fantastic at capturing. And this picture does it particularly well. Right? Even though she's facing us, we know as little about her as we do about the girl with her back to us. Right? We don't have any immediate psychological input. I think, Peyton, it might go back to what you were saying, which is, it's all things to all people. She has no expression.
Yeah.
Right?
Very blank.
And because it's blank, you can read anything into it.
Yeah.
I read bugger off. I read, okay. Yeah, but passively, right? It's like, the best way to be annoyed when some guy is bothering you, ladies, is to do what? If you react loudly, a lot of assholes out there think that's kind of cool, right? The best thing to do is, really? And not even say anything, but just sort of like, and get back to what you were doing. And I get the sense here that that's exactly, they're enjoying their little lunch, there's grapes here, for the girl. They're beautifully painted, too. They're just gorgeous. They really, and that puppy, right? This is a charming afternoon out that's been spoiled by Manet, right? Who's made his way in here to look at this. Let's see what I got in the way of details here. I might have one or two coming up. Oh, I got this. There's my wife, right where she is. We spent the whole afternoon looking for it, right? So that's exactly where they are there. And then I was going to displace people. The other Manet picture, these are people from Manet's neighborhood who are local musicians from the area. They lived in Paris with other people from the hood, little tumblers who performed for money, a guy who picked with a top hat who was a rag picker, and a drunkard. We know who they were, a woman. And they've been dislocated, right? They've been totally alienated by these renovations. So these are the slides that should have framed about. Okay, we'll come to that. Let's see what's coming up here next. I don't have a close-up. So I'll talk about this, and then I think I'll bring the close-ups in next class. And we'll move into Impressionism. This change to Paris, right? Evicting people that we see in the Old Musician in order to carve these areas, not for everybody, right? Who rides the trains, right? Well, certainly upper middle class and beyond, right? And this was part of the big critique that some people had, was that this is creating an old nice new Paris, but it's not for everybody, right? It's a nice new Paris for the few, right? And the people who used to live along the boulevards in these neighborhoods where the Old Musician used to live are being pushed outside of Paris. And this is still an argument in big cities that exists everywhere today, right? People who work the shops, the bodegas in New York, can't afford to live in New York, right? So they live, train right in from outside because that's what they can afford to do, right? Same thing in downtown DC, right? If you want to work somewhere along like the new H Street corridor, chances are you don't live along the H Street corridor, right? It's been priced out of your ability unless you've been there long enough, right, to be controlled. And in France, it's exactly the same issue to this day, right? That the people who live in the center of France are very, very few who can afford to live in the center of France, right? Okay, these are the people who have been evicted under this plan to change Paris that was begun by Napoleon III. Now, we'll do this little history lesson and then we'll von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, was trying to run through he was trying to unify Germany. And Napoleon III was resisting this, right? His attempts to sort of solidify power in the different areas of Germany together as one unit. And so what Bismarck did was to marshal the German armies to drive Napoleon III out of office. And he invades France, the Franco-Prussian War, right? Prussia is part of Germany, okay? So in 1870, German troops invade France. France surrenders almost immediately, right? Capitulates right away. And Bismarck doesn't really want to annex France. He just wants Napoleon III out of there. He wants the French to go back to a system of government that's not going to bother him and let him run Germany the way he wants to run it. Okay? So he invades France. In this case, the Franco-Prussian War. The city of Paris in 1870 holds out. We do not surrender. We are separate from the rest of France. We are a commune unto ourselves. France can surrender to the Germans, but Paris will continue to be free. The commune of Paris in 1870. Germans won't have any of it, right? First, they allow the French to set up a government, and after the French set up their government, after having toppled Napoleon III, right? Paris wants to remain independent from the rest of France as a commune, right? Independent from the rest of France. And the French troops go in and stomp them. Hundreds, thousands of people killed. Lots of Paris bombed to pieces because of the commune, because of the rebellion. And that meant that after 1871, after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, after the stifling of the commune, the Paris commune, right? After this, a lot of Paris was again about to be renovated one more time. Right? They had started the job under Napoleon III, and now, because so much of France, and particularly Paris, had been bombed, the heck bombed out of it, there were parts that needed rebuilding, and there was money coming from the government specifically for the rebuilding. Right? And people coming back to the city now for this rebuilding after the commune, after this horror that happened in 1870, 1871. So, with Manet's picture, if we're going to stir something into the mix, Peyton, with what you were saying before, with Manet's picture, right, the attitudes towards progress also have to be put into a historical context, right? So now we've got France newly surviving this invasion, rebuilding itself, entering into a new future, beginning in 1870. Rebuilding as a way of saying France is back on its feet. Progress as a symbol of national unity, national pride, national progress. Manet's picture should be, we have to stir this into the mix, right? So the ideas about progress temper depending on what we're talking about. It's one thing when it's Napoleon III who begins to evict the people. It's another thing if you're rebuilding after a war. Right? Those have very different connotations for how people might view these images of urban renewal. Now I'll bring in details of Manet. We'll wrap him up and move on to the Impressionists on whatever the next day we meet is Thursday. Right? And like I said, we should get through Post-Impressionism with at least a day to spare. And then we'll figure out what to do with our last week. So I will see you then. And again, the rest of the worksheets are coming up. One is up now. But again, they're all optional at this point, depending on how well you've done on the earlier ones.